Hi, I'm here today to talk to you about making bias binding from a square. This is a very common technique that you will find in a lot of bag making patterns. It is the easiest and quickest way to get a lot of bias binding out of just a square piece of fabric. So today I have a 22-inch square and I'm going to show you how I would go about making the bias binding from this square. And you might encounter a problem like this. This is the biggest size mat I have in my home, but my square is bigger than the mat. So I'm going to show you how I go about cutting it on a mat that's too small. So the first thing I would do is I'd already squared up this square on a bigger mat at work. I'm going to line up my straight edge along the straight line here and this straight edge along the straight line of the mat here. So now I have those two. Then I'm going to take the longest ruler I have, which happens to be a 6 by 24 inch, and they have some dashed lines on them that give you different angles. So this ruler has 30, 45, and 60 degree lines. So we want to cut this square diagonal, which is a 45 degree line. So I'm going to find my 45 degree dotted line and I am going to line it up along the straight edge of my fabric, making sure that the very edge of my ruler just meets the very tip of that square. Now you can see, because my square is larger than the mat, I am going to just move my mat carefully. Now that I have a Quilter Select, so my ruler's not going to move. And I'm actually going to use one of my other rulers, which is a 6 by 12 inch Quilter Select ruler. And I am going to just butt it up with the previous ruler, making it a straight line. And I can double check to make sure that I am truly on that 45 because the edge of this ruler is right at the tip of this square as well. Now that I'm sure that this ruler and the whole line goes, I'm going to move this ruler to the side. I'm going to move my mat closer to me so that I can rotary cut. Obviously, if you had a bigger mat, this would be easier, but you can do the same thing. The nice thing about the Quilter Select rulers is that they don't usually move once you have them set. So I'm going to go ahead and just move up here. So now I've cut the square all along my mat. I'm going to now move my fabric square up. And it doesn't really matter how you place it now, just that all that hasn't been cut is on the mat. And I'm going to use my big ruler and I'm going to line up with the edge that I already had cut and make sure it goes down through the corner. And now I'm going to cut the rest of my square. All right, so now you can see that that square is cut into two perfect right triangles. Now this is the part that a lot of people get confused about. Without rotating your pieces or flipping your pieces or anything, we are just going to change where they're oriented to each other to figure out what seam we need to sew. So I put one hand on this triangle and one hand on this triangle, and I literally just move one to the other side. Now I can see this is the seam that I want to sew together. This is the straight edge seam. What I'm going to do is now I'm going to flip this one triangle. It doesn't matter which triangle you flip. I just have a habit of flipping. This is the one to my left. I flip it so that this is straight, right sides together along that straight edge. Now the important thing when you're sewing this one is that you want to leave a little bit of a dog ear from your triangles. That will help account for your 1/4 inch seam so that once you sew that 1/4 inch, those two edges will meet perfectly. All right, I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew that, and I will be right back. All right, here I am. I have finished sewing that seam. I've laid it back down exactly how I had it before I took it to sew it. So you can see it makes this interesting parallelogram. So your bias edges are these ones here that we had cut. So that's where we want to trim across. So I am going to angle this because I want to be cutting along the bias. Now you can see I'm going to encounter another problem because my mat is not very big. So there are two ways that you could go about preparing to cut this bias tape. Number one, you could line up your ruler and just cut and then move it and keep cutting. But what I'm going to do is, keeping my bias edges lined up, I'm going to fold that in so that this line is matching. And then I'm going to fold this one in to make sure that straight edge, these are matching. And now you can see that my shape fits on my mat and therefore my ruler will be able to cut. Now there are two ways that you can do this. A lot of patterns recommend marking the bias strips before you cut. And I actually did that here with another sample. I don't know if the camera can see, but I went ahead and used my ruler and a chalk pencil and marked my 2.5 inch lines, and you could just cut that. Or I find it easy once you understand this technique is that you could just get this all prepared and using your handy dandy 6 by 24 inch ruler, I am going to line up my edge here with the 2.5 inch mark on my ruler. Now your pattern may actually call for something other than 2.5, but the pattern that I need calls for 2.5. Then we're going to take our rotary cutter and instead of marking it all, we're going to just cut 2.5 inch strips right across here. Oop, that little tip. So I'm going to just continue cutting my whole piece into these 2.5 inch strips. And then I will show you how to sew them together. Now you can see with this square, after I cut my last 2.5 inch strip, I ended up with a goofy little strip. That's very common in this. I think most pattern writers just make sure that the square is big enough that you get enough bias out, and sometimes you have little bits left over. And you can just save these or throw them away. I like to save them to stuff different things. All right, now that I have all my 2.5 inch strips, I now have to go back and seam them to make them continuous bias binding. So I'm gonna lay these all out here. I like to lay them all out with the angles being the same way. So you can see all the angles on this side are this way and all the angles on that side are that way. So what you do is, I guess I'll start down here. You're going to work at putting these together. So you see, if I seam these like this, I will have a continuous strip. So I fold it right sides together. And once again, you're going to need to do that 1/4 inch offset to get a perfectly straight line. Now, the way you can do that is exactly to make sure that you're sewing the right way. You can line these up like this and go, yes, that's my straight line. Make them go right sides together and then make sure you have those little offsets. I do that to each one. So you can just keep going. So like this one's ready to be sewn. This one's ready to be sewn. And we'll do the same thing with this last one, and then you will add those all together. I'm gonna go sew those and I'll be right back. All right, I am back from the sewing machine and I now have one long continuous strip of bias binding. Something that I forgot to mention earlier, when I did the first seam, I went to the iron and pressed my seams open. And after you seam all these strips together, you're going to want to press all the seams open. Now, one of the things about working on bags that have a smaller curved circumference that we're using the bias binding for is that sometimes when you iron this wrong sides together to go and use it, it will kind of pucker up funny when you're applying it to your bag. So I sometimes don't even bother at all. I just go to wait to use it, and then I fold it wrong sides together and just go ahead and stitch it and use my hands to put it in place. If you would like to try and make it stay more in place beforehand, you could pin it every couple inches or use clips to help hold it into this shape before you go to use it and pin it onto your bag to sew it. That is all. We have now made a bunch of binding from one square. See you next time.